Let's talk about utilizing Booleans inside of ZBrush. I'm just going to start out with a default sphere here, and the first thing that we need to realize is that ZBrush treats Booleans differently than a traditional program like Maya. What ZBrush is going to do is it's going to render the Boolean first. To activate your live Booleans or your render Booleans, you will need to have that setting enabled. In the default layout, it's just up here in the top panel beside the home page and the lightbox. If you have a custom layout or you prefer a different default layout, you'll find it under your render settings in the render drop-down menu here, just under your render Booleans. Okay. The next step is to have at least one or two objects in scene. I'm just going to quickly duplicate this with Control-Shift-D to allow that to be my secondary object in here. Booleans inside of ZBrush are always decided first through the subtool menu in descending order. Right? So we'll go from the top, saying this is the object that is going to receive the Boolean, and then the next object or objects are the ones that are going to apply the standard Boolean types. The standard Boolean types can be found in the subtool menu here, just beside the object icon. The circular menu items are where you'll find ZBrush's Boolean types. The first type is two circles that are going to join it together, right? So an additive Boolean. The next circle, right, is a subtractive type, so a negative Boolean. Right? And then the third type is your final overlap Boolean. Right? The wonderful thing about this is, just as the button says up top, is it is a live Boolean, which means I can adjust either one or the other of the objects in the scene and still have ZBrush apply the render of the Boolean process. This works because it's just showing me what it's going to look like if we were to apply the Boolean or Booleans. So if I duplicate this out, and it's much easier to apply negative Booleans to see a quicker result. But we can also do many different objects inside here. Now, depending on what you're asking ZBrush to do with the Booleans, and especially how you ask it to treat the polygons afterwards, is definitely going to have a large effect on this. So I'm going to set up some Booleans here. And very specifically, I'm going to take a look at the descending order here. I'm looking at my resulting Boolean render, and I'm not quite enjoying how the circle is intersecting the original one, but leaving the square intact. To adjust that, I will rearrange one of the Booleans. By adjusting the square and putting it on top of the negative space sphere Boolean, right, you can see that the sphere is now affecting every object that's above it. So you can adjust this and change it until you get the desired effect. And even do sculpting to change how this is going to look. I'm just going to do a relatively complex Boolean. I do foresee some issues with the mesh resolve and certain sharp corners like this, but just as an example, we'll go ahead and process this. There's two ways to process the Boolean. The first one is in the subtool menu again, under the Boolean drop-down menu with a button that says Make Boolean Mesh. If this is grayed out, it's because you do not have your live Boolean applied. So you can see what the preview of this looks like. There we go. You can always toggle that on and off in the drop-down menu here, or again, in the render menu. Okay. Hitting the Make Boolean Mesh will apply the Booleans as they are in order, right, and give me a new subtool in the subtool palette over here. Every time we see a Boolean mesh, it's going to give me a name of uMesh and then whatever the inherited name of the parent object was. So we can see what this has created, and we can see that it has indeed affected our geometry. Now, the problem with this is Boolean meshes need to be remeshed before they can be used and sculpted and have any sort of application. The topology along the Boolean insert is very, very, very inefficient. Right? Although it does exactly what ZBrush needs to do to get exactly what you want done, in the Boolean result. Right? How are we going to treat this? Well, we can treat this in a couple of different ways. Right? I could try Dynamesh, but I'm not a big fan of that Dynamesh, so I will prefer to go to my geometry menu and take a look at the ZRemesh options. Now, by default, right, my preferred way of using ZRemesh is to turn the same amount of polygons on, turn adapt off. Adapt affects the final resulting polygon, so it gives it more or less depending on how ZBrush seems to want to process it. I like to have a bit of control over my resulting polygon result. So if I say the exact same, I should hopefully get around 7,000 polygons. Right? Now, by default, we'll see what this does. I'll hit the button and it's done a decent job on this, but not clearly a desirable or usable result. Right? We can influence this in a couple different ways. Right? The first way is going to be through keeping our polygroups. Typically, especially at lower polygon levels, I like to turn off my smooth polygroups, especially if I'm utilizing more hard surface transitions in here. And we'll see what ZBrush does with this result now that I'm utilizing that. It's a much, much, much better result, although not perfect. Definitely some issues with corners and some of the transitions here and some of the overlaps here. The better way to go through that is by utilizing some of our default polygroup options. Our groups will just regroup everything that is present and unmasked or present and masked to their own polygroups, right? But this isn't going to give us an efficient result. Right? Preferably, I'll utilize the group by normals section. Right? It's set to a default angle, so it's going to measure the angle of degrees separating the polygon faces, and if it's surpassing the angle amount set here in the subtool menu, it will assign a new polygroup. The better and more accurate assignment of polygroups, the better the ZRemesh result, which is key to utilizing live Booleans. You can see with this result, I do get a much better result, although not quite desirable. Again, this is something I'm going to have to go through quite a bit to adjust. Thankfully, what we can do is use Control, Shift, and left click on certain polygroups that are not working as efficiently as we want them to, and then reassign polygroups automatically by our polygroup group by normal submenu. If the group angle doesn't meet your requirements, adjust it lower, preferably, or higher. Right? What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a clear transition between flat angle degrees, where I know I will want an established edge, okay, and rounder surface. This is a much, much, much more preferable result. Control-Shift-Tap on the inner polygroup, which isn't working as well, will allow me to do the same thing. By hiding the existing polygroups, I will not affect their assignment. I will only affect the assignment of the polygroups that are currently visible. And then Control-Shift-Tap to bring back the entire object. With a bit more of an accurate polygroup assignment here, going back to my subtool menu and keeping the exact same settings should result in a much more efficient ZRemesh transition. You can see it's still not perfect. Okay? This tool is wonderful. Right? There's a couple things I can try to see if it will work a little bit better. I'm going to turn my symmetry back on. Right? That way it will remesh the screen left side first and copy it to the right, and hopefully give me a slightly better transition and result. This is much, much, much easier. Still not quite perfect, right? But a lot closer to something that I can use efficiently. There's a couple more settings that we can try and utilize inside of the ZRemesh menu to get a much more efficient Boolean result. Right? As well as keeping on my groups, I might tell ZBrush to detect hard edges. We can tell it to detect edges, which, if separated by a sharp enough angle, it should establish a hard edge parameter and keep that value in there. This is much more efficient. Now, it has established a crease value inside of here, and I'll tell how to deal with that in a later video. But this is much, much more efficient for a relatively complex Boolean value. I more than likely would get a much better result if I transitioned these step by step, right, and was a little bit more careful with some of the PolyGroup and Boolean assignments on the inside values. But overall, this is working out quite well. I think one of the issues is the inside to outside transition on this sphere that's causing a little bit more of an inefficient result than what I would like. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back. I'm going to redo this and attempt to get the settings correct with my polygroups until I get what I want. So let's see, mask by angle again, down at 30 degrees. It separates the inside shell from the outside shell. Wonderful, that seems a lot more efficient. Okay, let's try that one more time. All right. With these settings and see what we get. There we go. This is a lot more efficient. And I'm assuming something like this doesn't transform, right? So it's not really going to bend, it's more of a hard surface object. So I can get away with a little bit more inefficient flow with the auto generation. Right? Another thing that I can try and do is doubling the amount of polygons first, right? Just give me a resulting mesh that I can work with, and then reduce by about half until I start losing the shape. Right? Again, this is an automated process, and we are going to get as efficient of a result as we can generate without having to retopologize manually. Right? And again, especially for something that's not deforming like this likely would, what I want to do is establish at the very least seams along geometry edges where I can cut this apart for UVs to make it a lot easier to handle. So, in combination with our ZRemesh and some of our polygrouping tools, live Booleans become very, very effective.